Los Angeles, 2001. Long after the engineers went home and the lights in the building were turned off, one studio room was still glowing. Inside, Michael Jackson was alone. No entourage, no producers, no security giving instructions. Just Michael, a piano, a microphone, and memories he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. That night, Michael asked for one thing before everyone left. Please don't come back until morning. What happened in those hours was not an album session. It wasn't a rehearsal. And it wasn't meant for the public. Michael locked the door, sat on the floor of the studio, and began recording something no one expected. Raw confessions, unfinished melodies, spoken words never polished for the world. At one point, he stopped singing altogether and just talked about fear, loneliness, childhood, and the exhaustion of being Michael Jackson. Years later, when parts of that recording surfaced, people were stunned, not by his talent, but by his pain. What drove Michael to isolate himself that night? What did he say when he believed no one would ever listen? And why did those recordings scare the people who heard them afterward? Stay with this story, because this night reveals a side of Michael Jackson the world was never supposed to know. Los Angeles, late summer 2001. It was nearly midnight when the last producer packed his bag and shut down his equipment at the recording studio on Santa Monica Boulevard. The hallway lights dimmed automatically, leaving only a soft glow leaking from under one door at the far end of the building. That door led to Studio B, and inside was Michael Jackson. Michael had been quiet all evening, not withdrawn exactly, but distant, polite, focused in a way that made people uneasy. He thanked everyone individually, hugged a few, and then made a simple request that felt heavier than it sounded. Please don't come back until morning, he said softly. I need to stay. This wasn't unusual behavior for most artists, but for Michael Jackson, it was. He rarely stayed completely alone. There was almost always someone nearby, security, assistants, engineers, friends. Michael had lived his entire life surrounded by people, watched constantly, managed constantly. True solitude was rare. Yet tonight, he needed it. After the door closed behind the last staff member, the silence settled in. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that hums in your ears when there's nothing left to distract you. Michael stood still in the center of the studio, listening. No voices, no footsteps, no expectations. Just him. He removed his jacket and placed it carefully on a chair, then walked slowly around the room, touching familiar objects as if grounding himself. The piano, the microphone stand, the mixing board. This studio had witnessed countless hits, rehearsals, arguments, laughter. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt final in a way Michael couldn't explain. Earlier that day, he had tried to go home. He'd gotten into the car, driven halfway toward Neverland, and suddenly felt something closing on his chest. Not a panic attack, exactly. More like an emotional paralysis. His driver noticed him staring out the window, unmoving. Sir, are you okay? Michael didn't answer at first. Then he whispered, almost embarrassed, I don't want to go home. Neverland had once been his refuge, a place of imagination, safety, and childhood fantasy. But lately, it felt like a museum of things he couldn't reclaim. Empty rides, quiet halls, echoes of laughter that no longer existed. The studio, on the other hand, still listened. Michael sat at the piano and pressed a single key. The note lingered in the air longer than it should have. He pressed another, then another. No melody yet, just sound, just proof he was still there. At 43 years old, Michael Jackson was carrying more than fame. He was carrying decades of expectations, misunderstandings, lawsuits, headlines, and an identity so large it barely left room for the person underneath. The world still saw the icon, the legend, the king of pop. But the man sitting alone in studio felt tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Earlier that week, a journalist had asked him a question that refused to leave his mind. Do you feel understood now after everything? Michael smiled politely at the time. He always did. But inside, the answer echoed clearly. No, not at all. He reached for the microphone and adjusted its height, not to sing, but out of habit. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from thousands of sessions. Then he stopped. He stepped back. "I don't want to perform tonight," he whispered to the empty room. "I just want to talk." Michael had been in therapy on and off for years. He understood the language of trauma, at least intellectually. He knew his childhood had been abnormal. He knew the discipline had crossed lines. He knew fame had complicated everything. But knowing something doesn't make it lighter. He sat on the floor, back against the piano bench, knees pulled toward his chest. This was how he used to sit as a child backstage, waiting for his cue, listening to crowds scream his name while wishing he could disappear. The same feeling crept in now. Michael thought about his children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, sleeping somewhere far away, safe for the moment. They were the one part of his life that felt real without effort. With them, he didn't have to perform. He didn't have to be Michael Jackson. He could just be Dad. And yet, even that role came with fear. Fear that he'd pass down his pain. Fear that the world would eventually reach him the way it had reached him. He stood up suddenly and walked back to the microphone. "Test," he said quietly. The sound of his own voice through the speakers startled him. It sounded older than he felt. Fragile. Human. Michael hesitated, then pressed the record button. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that this moment would become one of the most revealing nights of his life. Not because of the song, but because of what happens when someone who's been watched since childhood finally believes no one is watching anymore. He wasn't recording for an audience. He wasn't recording for history. He was recording because the silence had become unbearable. And for the first time in years, Michael Jackson was about to speak without editing himself for the world. What he said next would never have been shared if someone hadn't found the tape years later. And when they did, they understood something chilling. This wasn't the night Michael Jackson created music. This was the night he tried to unburden his soul. Los Angeles, 2001. By the time the studio hallway went silent, Michael Jackson was completely alone. The engineers had packed up slowly that night, sensing something unusual in his mood. Michael was polite, soft-spoken, but distant, thanking everyone repeatedly, almost apologetically, as if he were about to do something that required forgiveness in advance. When the last technician asked if he needed anything else, Michael paused for a long moment before answering. "No," he said quietly. "I just need time." The heavy studio door closed behind the staff with a muted thud. The sound echoed down the corridor, then disappeared. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, Michael Jackson was truly by himself. Inside the studio, the lights were dim. Only the soft glow from a mixing console and a small lamp near the piano illuminated the room. The air smelled faintly of dust, wood, and old tape, comforting, familiar scents Michael had known since childhood. Studios were the closest thing he had ever had to a safe place. Not home, not hotels, not mansions. Studios didn't judge. They listened. Michael didn't go straight to the microphone. Instead, he sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest. He stayed there for a long time, staring at nothing. The silence was loud, deafening in a way only true isolation can be. No cameras, no expectations, no audience waiting to be impressed. Just his thoughts. And that was the problem. For most of his life, Michael had filled silence with sound. Music, rehearsals, performances. If he kept moving, kept creating, the memories couldn't catch him. But that night, exhaustion had finally won. His body ached. His voice was tired. And his mind was crowded with things he had spent decades avoiding. He thought about how young he had been when this all started. How he never chose fame. It chose him. How applause had replaced affection, and performance had replaced childhood. He thought about the people who claimed to love him, but only showed up when he was useful. About how even silence from the world felt violent after years of constant noise. Eventually, Michael stood up and walked slowly toward the piano. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He didn't sit properly on the bench. Instead, he lowered himself onto the edge, hunched forward, his fingers hovering above the keys without touching them. For a moment, he looked like a child again, unsure, hesitant, afraid to make the first sound. Then he pressed a single key. The The note hung in the air, raw and imperfect. Michael pressed another, then another. No melody yet, just searching, feeling, letting his hands move without direction. This wasn't how he usually worked. Normally, everything was precise, planned, controlled. But tonight, control felt impossible. After a few minutes, he reached for the microphone. He didn't stand. He pulled it down to his level. Sitting on the floor again, the mic close to his mouth. He pressed record. At first, there was only breathing. Long, uneven breaths. You can hear him swallow. You can hear the fabric of his jacket shift as he moves. He didn't realize, or didn't care, that the tape was capturing everything. Then he spoke. "I don't know how to stop," Michael said softly. There was no audience in his voice. No performance. No rhythm. Just honesty. "I don't know who I am when I'm not doing this." He paused, as if listening to his own words surprised him. "I've been Michael Jackson for so long. I don't know if there's anything else left." He laughed quietly, not amused, but wounded. "They say I'm lucky. They say I'm blessed. But they don't know what it costs to never be alone and always feel lonely." Michael leaned forward, resting his forehead against his knees. "When I was little, I thought if I sang well enough, danced well enough, someone would finally stay. Someone would finally choose me. Not the music, not the fame. Me." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. "I'm tired," he whispered. Not tired like sleep. Tired like existing. There was a long silence after that. Nearly a full minute where nothing happened except the faint hum of the equipment. Most artists would have erased that space. Michael didn't. It felt important to let the quiet exist. Eventually, he stood up again and returned to piano. This time, the notes came together. Slow, mournful chords. Not a pop song. Not even something that felt finished. It sounded like someone trying to remember something they'd lost. Michael began to sing, barely above a whisper. Not lyrics, just vowels, sounds, emotions without language. Halfway through, he stopped suddenly. "No," he said to himself. "That's not honest enough." He pressed stop, then record again. "This isn't for anyone," he said quietly. "This is just me." What followed wasn't music in the traditional sense. It was confession layered over sound. He talked about fear, of being misunderstood, of being remembered wrong, of dying before anyone truly knew him. He talked about how applause felt empty once the lights went out. How love, when it came with conditions, stopped feeling like love at all. At one point, he said something that would later unsettle everyone who heard the tape. "If people really heard this," Michael said, "they wouldn't call me strange anymore. They'd call me broken." He paused. "Or maybe they already do." By the time the first hint of dawn crept through the small studio window, Michael's voice was hoarse. His eyes were red. His body looked smaller somehow, like he had poured something essential into the tape and left it there. He finally stood, walked to the door, and rested his hand on the handle. Before leaving, he turned back toward the microphone. "If someone ever hears this," he said quietly, "I hope they understand I tried. I really tried to be good." Then he turned off the lights and walked out, leaving behind a recording that was never meant to survive him, and yet somehow did. And that night would change how a few people saw Michael Jackson forever. The tape was not labeled. That, more than anything else, was what made it dangerous. It sat inside a plain plastic case, tucked into a cardboard box beneath dozens of other studio reels. Rough mixes, instrumentals, unfinished demos that never left the room. No title, no date, no warning. Just magnetic tape holding the most unguarded version of Michael Jackson anyone would ever hear. For months, it stayed there untouched. Michael never asked for it, never referenced it, never hinted that such a recording existed. In fact, after that night, he seemed to behave as if it hadn't happened at all. He returned to rehearsals, to meetings, to smiling softly for cameras, to being Michael Jackson again. But something had changed. Those who worked closely with him noticed at first. He was quieter, not withdrawn, just more careful, as if he were conserving energy, choosing words with greater intention. He spent less time correcting others, less time perfecting details that once consumed him. Sometimes, during playback sessions, he would stop the music abruptly and stare at the speakers as if listening to something beyond sound. "Do you ever feel like people only hear what they want?" he asked one engineer one afternoon. The engineer laughed nervously, unsure how to answer. Michael smiled politely, then turned back to the console. "Never mind." The tape remained hidden until the summer of 2002, when a routine archive reorganization brought it back into the light. It was an assistant, new, well-meaning, unaware, who found it. He had been tasked with cataloging old sessions, digitizing anything that hadn't yet been backed up. Most of the tapes were easy, titles written in Michael's looping handwriting, dates, song names, instructions. But when he opened the unlabeled case, he hesitated. "Do you know what this one is?" he asked another staff member. The other shrugged. Probably nothing. If it mattered, it would have a name. That assumption would haunt him. They loaded the tape. At first, they thought it was blank. Then they heard breathing. Long, uneven breaths. The sound of fabric shifting. A chair creaking. The hum of the studio. It didn't sound like a song session. It sounded like someone forgetting they were being recorded. The assistant leaned closer to the speakers. And then Michael's voice filled the room. "I don't know how to stop." The room froze. No one spoke. No one moved. They listened, not as professionals, not as employees, but as human beings suddenly allowed into a space they were never meant to enter. As the tape continued, discomfort spread through the room like electricity. This wasn't the Michael Jackson they knew. There was no rhythm, no melody guiding the emotion, no performance protecting the vulnerability. This was a man unraveling gently, quietly, in real time. When the tape reached the part where Michael said, "If people really heard this, they wouldn't call me strange anymore. They'd call me broken." One of them reached for the stop button. Another said softly, "No, let it play." They listened to everything. When it ended, no one spoke for a long time. Finally, the assistant whispered, Was that meant for us?" No one answered. The ethical question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. This recording was clearly private, intimate, almost sacred. And yet, here it was, existing, vulnerable to misuse simply because it existed at all. They agreed on one thing immediately. Michael could never know they'd heard it. The tape was placed back in its case. The box returned to storage. But the damage was done. Once something is heard, it cannot be unheard. And the way they saw Michael, how could it ever return to what was before? From that point on, small changes appeared in how people treated him. They were subtle, almost imperceptible. A longer pause before speaking, a gentler tone, less pressure to push through. People stopped joking about his eccentricities behind his back. Some avoided eye contact entirely, burdened by knowledge they didn't know how to carry. Michael noticed. He always noticed. One afternoon, during a playback session, he turned to the assistant, the same one who had found a tape, and asked a question that landed too close to the truth. "Have you ever heard someone say something they didn't mean for anyone else to hear?" Michael asked calmly. The assistant swallowed. "I think everyone has said things like that, at some point." Michael nodded slowly. "And what do you think they'd want?" "I think," the assistant said carefully, "they'd want to be respected." Michael studied his face for a long moment. Then he smiled, small, genuine, almost relieved. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." That night, Michael returned home quieter than usual. He sat alone in his bedroom long after the house had gone still, thinking about something he couldn't quite name, a sense of exposure without proof, vulnerability without confession, as if a part of him had been seen through a crack he never opened. He didn't know about the tape being played, but he felt the shift. For the first time in his life, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt watchful. Weeks later, Michael requested that certain old studio materials be moved, archived more securely. Fewer people involved. No explanation given. No accusations made. Just quiet adjustments, like someone locking a door without announcing why. The tape remained where it was, waiting. Years would pass before anyone outside that small room would ever learn of its existence. And when it finally surfaced, long after Michael was gone, it would spark debates, headlines, arguments about privacy versus legacy, art versus exploitation. But in that moment, it was something else entirely. It was proof. Proof that behind the spectacle, behind the myth, behind the accusations and adoration, there had been a man sitting on a studio floor at 3 a.m, whispering into a microphone because he didn't know where else to put the truth. And the people who heard it first understood something the world would take years to grasp. Michael Jackson wasn't hiding from the world. He was protecting what little of himself he still had left. The first rumor didn't come from a headline. It came from a whisper, a quiet conversation between two sound engineers at a studio cafe. A half-finished sentence, a lowered voice, a pause that lingered a little too long. "Have you noticed how people are treating him lately?" one asked. The other nodded slowly. "Yeah, like they know something they shouldn't." Rumors don't need facts to grow. They only need silence. And Michael Jackson's life had always been wrapped in it. By late 2002, something subtle but undeniable had shifted in the way the industry moved around him. Not fans, not the public, the inner circle, the professionals who had spent decades around artists, egos, breakdowns, and reinventions. They sensed fragility, not weakness, something deeper, something human. Michael felt it too. He felt it in the way people hesitated before asking for another take, in the way executives softened their language during meetings, in the way longtime collaborators looked at him as if he might disappear if handled too roughly. One afternoon, during a rehearsal break, Michael sat alone on a folding chair at the edge of the stage. Sweat dampened his collar. The room buzzed with activity, but no one approached him directly. Finally, one dancer did. "You okay, Michael?" she asked gently. He looked up, surprised. "Of course," he said, smiling. "Why?" She hesitated. "I don't know. You just seem quieter." Michael laughed softly. "I've always been quiet." She nodded, unconvinced, then walked away. He stayed seated, hands folded, staring at the empty seats beyond the stage. For a moment, he imagined what it would be like to tell the truth openly, not through music, not through metaphor, not through interviews carefully shaped by lawyers and publicists. Just truth. The thought terrified him, not because he feared judgment, because he feared relief. Around the same time, the first leak occurred, not of the tape itself, but of its existence. An anonymous post appeared on a niche industry forum. No names, no audio, just a sentence buried deep in a thread about unreleased recordings. There's a tape of MJ talking to himself. Not singing, talking. It's not what people think. Most readers ignored it. A few didn't. Speculation followed, as it always did. Was it a breakdown? A confession? A drug-induced ramble? Or just another exaggeration in a career plagued by myth-making? Michael never saw the post, but he felt the ripple. Phone calls increased. Old acquaintances reached out just to check in. Journalists pitched interviews framed as intimate, raw, unfiltered, words that sounded compassionate but felt invasive. Michael declined them all. One evening, he sat with his mother, Catherine, in her living room. She watched him closely as he stirred his tea, without drinking it. "You're carrying something," she said finally. Michael looked at her, startled. "Am I?" "Yes," she replied gently. "You always do when you think you're protecting everyone else." He sighed and leaned back into the couch. "I just don't want things twisted anymore." Catherine nodded. "Then don't let them twist you." He smiled sadly. "I don't know how to stop them." "You don't," she said. "You just decide who gets access to your heart." That night, Michael made a decision. Not to speak, but to document. Over the next few months, he began recording private audio journals again. This time intentionally. Not for release. Not for legacy. But for clarity. He spoke about exhaustion. About the confusion of being loved by millions and understood by almost no one. About the fear that if he ever stopped performing, the world would stop listening. "These aren't secrets," he said into the recorder one night. "They're just thoughts people don't usually ask for." He stored them carefully, labeled, locked away. Unlike the first tape, these were meant to exist. Still, the world circled. In early 2003, a journalist approached a former studio assistant with a vague question. Have you ever heard Michael just talk? Like really talk? The assistant froze. No, he said quickly. Just music. The journalist studied him, then smiled thinly. That's not what I heard. The assistant left the cafe shaken. Word reached Michael within days. Not specifics. Just the sense that something was moving closer to the surface. Something private. Something delicate. For the first time in his life, Michael considered preemptive honesty, a controlled revelation, a carefully chosen moment where he could speak for himself before others spoke about him. But every scenario ended the same way. The truth would not land gently. It never did, so he chose silence again. In public, he smiled. He waved. He danced when required. He gave just enough to maintain the image without feeding the hunger behind it. In private, he grew more reflective. If they hear me, he said once to a trusted friend, they might finally understand. But understanding doesn't always come with kindness. The friend nodded. But hiding doesn't bring peace either. Michael looked away. I'm not hiding. I'm choosing. By mid-2003, the whispers faded. Not because curiosity disappeared, but because nothing surfaced. No tape, no confirmation, no scandal to consume. The world moved on, but the people who had heard that first recording never forgot it. They carried it quietly, like a shared secret that reshaped their understanding of the man they worked for. They protected it, not out of fear, but out of respect. And Michael, sensing that protection without knowing its source, felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not safety, but patience. Whatever would come from that night in the studio, whatever truths might one day escape into the world, would come on their own time, not in whispers, not in leaks, but when the silence itself was ready to speak. The night Michael Jackson collapsed on stage was not supposed to be historic. It was supposed to be routine, a packed arena, a familiar set list, lights timed to the second, dancers in position, medics on standby, as they always were. Not because anyone expected disaster, but because Michael insisted on preparedness. Control had always been his armor. Backstage, moments before the show, Michael stood alone in front of a full-length mirror. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed the fabric, then paused. His reflection looked thinner than usual. His eyes, still luminous, carried a heaviness he could no longer hide from himself. "You can do this," he whispered, not as motivation, but as reassurance. A stage manager knocked lightly. 2 minutes, Michael." He nodded. "Thank you." As the door closed, Michael placed a hand over his chest. His heartbeat felt uneven. Not fast, off. He inhaled slowly, counting, grounding himself the way therapists had taught him. This isn't fear, he told himself. It's exhaustion. The music cue hit. The roar of the crowd rolled through the walls like thunder. Michael stepped into the wings, the familiar heat of the lights washing over him. The first note rang out. The curtain rose. The arena erupted. For the first few minutes, everything felt normal. Muscle memory carried him. His feet moved where they always had. His body responded automatically, as if dancing were a reflex rather than an effort. But halfway through the second song, something shifted. It started as dizziness, subtle, like the floor had tilted by a degree only he could feel. He blinked hard, refocused on the front rows, smiled. Then came the ringing in his ears. The band kept playing. The dancers stayed in formation. The audience saw nothing wrong, just Michael Jackson commanding a stage the way he always had. Inside his body, alarms were going off. His chest tightened. His breath shortened. He missed a step. Just barely, but enough for a dancer to glance at him, concern flashing across her face. Michael raised a hand slightly. "I'm okay." He wasn't. As he moved toward center stage, the lights suddenly felt blinding. The sound distorted, as if underwater. He tried to sing, but his voice didn't come out the way it should have. He took one more step. Then his legs gave way. Michael Jackson collapsed. For a fraction of a second, the crowd thought it was choreography. Then the music stopped. Silence fell over the arena. Thousands of people frozen in confusion as Michael lay motionless on the stage. A dancer rushed to him, kneeling. "Michael," she whispered urgently. He was conscious, but barely. The world spun, faces blurred. He tried to speak, to reassure them, but his mouth wouldn't cooperate. Security and medics sprinted onto the stage. Whispers rippled through the audience. Phones were raised, then lowered, then raised again as people realized this was not part of the show. The silence grew heavier. And then something unexpected happened. From the front rows, a single voice cut through the stillness. "Michael, it's okay." It was a woman. Young, clear, not screaming, not hysterical, just steady. Another voice joined in. Then another. "We're here. You're safe. We love you." The words spread like a wave, soft at first, then stronger. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't chant his name. They spoke to him. Thousands of strangers, instinctively choosing gentleness. Michael heard them. Through the fog, through the ringing, through the fear, he heard the voices, not as noise, but as presence. Tears welled in his eyes. One of the medics leaned close. "Michael, can you hear me?" He nodded faintly. "You're going to be okay. We're taking you off stage." As they lifted him onto the stretcher, the audience did something unprecedented. They stayed silent. No boos, no panic, no shouting, just quiet respect as he was carried away. Backstage, the medics worked quickly. Oxygen, monitoring, calm, controlled urgency. Someone asked him questions to keep him alert. "What's your name?" "Michael," he whispered. "Do you know where you are?" "On stage," he said, then corrected himself weakly. Backstage. They smiled reassuringly. As the ambulance doors closed, the noise of the crowd returned. Not as chaos, but applause. Long sustained. Not demanding more. Saying thank you. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what Michael already suspected. Severe exhaustion, dehydration, stress compounded by months of pushing past limits his body had been begging him to respect. "You've been running on empty for a long time," one doctor said gently. "Your body finally forced you to stop." Michael stared at the ceiling, the words echoing, forced to stop. Later that night, alone in his room, he replayed the moment in his mind. Not the collapse, but the silence that followed, the voices, the compassion, the way the audience had chosen care over consumption. One fan, he learned later, had started it. The first calm voice that broke the silence. She never screamed, never demanded attention. She just spoke to him the way you speak to another human being in pain. Michael asked for her name. He never forgot it. In the days that followed, headlines exploded. Speculation, concern, opinions. Everyone wanted to explain what had happened, to assign meaning, blame, narrative, but Michael already knew what it meant. For the first time in his life, the world had stopped with him, not because he was performing, not because he was entertaining, but because he was human. And as he rested, recovering, something shifted inside him, quietly, irrevocably. He had spent decades believing that if he stopped moving, stopped dancing, stopped giving, he would disappear. That night proved the opposite. When he fell, the world didn't turn away. It leaned in, and that changed everything. The days after Michael Jackson collapsed on stage passed in a strange, unfamiliar quiet. No rehearsals, no choreography reviews, no countdown clocks ticking toward the next performance. Just stillness. Michael lay in a private hospital room overlooking the city. Curtains half drawn, sunlight spilling softly across the white sheets. Machines beeped steadily, not urgently, just enough to remind him that his body had finally demanded to be heard. Doctors came and went. Tests were run. Questions were asked. Recommendations were made. Rest. Hydration. Reduce stress. Listen to your limits. Michael nodded politely every time, but inside, something deeper was happening. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of stopping. In the past, rest had always felt like failure, like laziness, like danger. If he stopped moving, the world would move on without him, or worse, turn against him. That fear had driven him for decades, whispering that love was conditional, applause temporary, worth fragile. But the memory of the arena kept returning. Not the fall, the silence, the voices. He closed his eyes and heard them again, gentle, steady, human. You're safe. We're here. It's okay. No one had ever said those words to him like that before. Not without expectation. Not without demand. They hadn't asked him to get up. They hadn't asked him to perform. They had allowed him to be weak. That realization unsettled him more than the collapse itself. A few days later, his children visited. Prince stood near the window, trying to look composed, but failing. Paris sat on the edge of the chair closest to the bed, her fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of her jacket. Blanket stayed close to Michael, holding his hand tightly. You scared us, Paris said softly. I know, Michael replied, his voice quiet but steady. I'm sorry. Blanket squeezed his hand. Are you going to be okay? Michael looked at his children, really looked at them. Their faces held concern, yes, but also something else. Relief. They hadn't lost him. Yeah, he said. I am, because I finally listened. Prince frowned slightly. Listen to what? Michael smiled faintly. My body, my heart. He didn't tell them everything, not yet, but he told them this. That night, when I fell, the people didn't leave. They didn't get angry. They didn't demand more. They waited. They cared. Paris's eyes filled with tears. Of course they did. You're not a machine, Dad. The words landed harder than she knew. Not a machine. After they left, Michael asked his assistant for something unusual. Find the fan, he said. The one who spoke first. It took days, but eventually they did. She wasn't famous. She hadn't recorded herself. She hadn't sold her story. She hadn't even told many people she'd been there. She had simply gone home shaken, grateful, and quiet. Michael wrote her a letter by hand. Not a public thank you. Not a grand gesture. Just a letter. He told her that her voice had reached him when everything else faded. That her calm had anchored him. That she had reminded him he was allowed to exist without performing. He ended it simply. You didn't save my life, but you gave me permission to keep living it differently. He never shared the letter publicly. Some things were meant to stay human. In the weeks that followed, Michael canceled shows, something unthinkable to him once. The backlash came as expected. Opinions, disappointment, accusations. But something inside him had changed. For the first time, the noise outside was quieter than the truth inside. He spent mornings sitting in the garden with his children, afternoons listening to music without analyzing it, evenings writing not songs, just thoughts. One entry read, I always believed silence meant abandonment. Now I know silence can mean care. He met with doctors again, this time asking different questions. Not, how soon can I perform? But, how do I live longer? Not, what will the fans think? But what does my body need? The answers weren't glamorous. They weren't dramatic. They were simple. And for Michael Jackson, simplicity felt revolutionary. Months later, when he finally returned to the stage, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, something was different. He moved with intention, not urgency. He sang with feeling, not force. He paused when he needed to. He smiled more. And when the crowd applauded, he accepted it, not as proof of worth, but as shared joy. Sometimes mid-performance, he would remember the night he fell, and instead of fear, he felt gratitude, because that night had given him something he had never known he was allowed to have. Rest without guilt, love without demand, silence without abandonment. The world would always remember Michael Jackson for spectacle, the moonwalk, the glove, the impossible precision. But he remembered something else. The night he stopped moving and discovered he was still held.